You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Joann Fax, Senior Consultant.
Today we are joined by Dean Danielle Holley-Walker from the Howard University School of Law. Our topic for today is the role of the chair in search committees, and we are just delighted to have Dean Holley-Walker with us. Welcome, Dean. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
Yeah, this is an exciting topic, and I know one that interests many people because search committees are like the backbone of a search process, and
Absolutely.
they don't go well, then we know how things can come out. So our first question today is, how different were your experiences when you first time you served as chair of a search committee, and as it has gone on over the years, what have you seen are the major differences for you as you have these assignments?
Well, I've served as a search committee chair one time, but I have served on, I think, 5 other search committees. And so the first time I served on a search committee, I was actually an assistant professor. And then, of course, I was chair as dean here at Howard. I think the main thing is that depending on your role in the search committee, you have a very different experience. And it's obviously one experience being a member of a search committee and being the most junior member of a search committee versus actually leading a search committee. So my experiences as being a member of a search committee were actually hugely informative for me as chair of a committee because I could really relate to all of the different members of the committee. So from our most junior members of the committee, the assistant professors who somehow drew this assignment, all the way to the tenured faculty members, pretty much at every stage of my academic career, I've served on dean search committees. And so that to me was a tremendous advantage being chair of the committee, is that I could relate to the other committee members and understand kind of what their fears might be, what their anxieties might be, what their concerns were. And so I think that's really the biggest difference, is if you serve as chair of a search committee at various times, your experience hopefully will inform every single time you do it, but don't put aside the kind of earlier points in your career where maybe you weren't the dean of a individual school or college, so you would not have been the chair. Utilize the previous experiences you've had serving on committees in general. And if you've ever been on a search committee before, that can also be very important experience for your time as chair.
What personal and professional attributes of a search committee chair are critical to improving the likelihood of a successful search?
I'd have to say the number one thing that I would say to any committee chair that's critical in terms of having a successful search is you really have to make the commitment. I think doing search committees is a huge amount of time. Deans are very pressed for time in terms of all of the demands on us, in terms of fundraising, faculty governance. You may be doing hiring that year. You may be teaching, general management of your facility, et cetera. So that search will be just one of many things on your plate. But the truth is, if the chair isn't highly committed to the success of the search and puts in the time and effort that it takes to really do a great job, the search will not be successful. So it really starts with the commitment of the chair. I think one of the reasons that commitment, and I think talking about your commitment to the search is so critical, is that it signals to other members of the committee the priority that they also have to place on the search, because everyone on the committee will be very busy. But if people start missing meetings, if they fail to attend trainings, if they do not do their homework on the candidates beforehand, you really have to set the example as chair by putting in that full commitment and talking about what your commitment is. So I would say that's the number one thing, is to be fully committed. I'd say two is take a lot of time on the front end of the search, understanding the unit that you're doing the search for. So for example, I was chairing a dean search for our College of Engineering and Architecture. I'm obviously not an engineer or an architect or computer science scientists, which are the disciplines. So it really took me a while in terms of studying what does it mean to do very successful education in engineering or in architecture or computer science? What is important to a faculty at a College of Engineering and Architecture, which is very different from the things that are important to law faculty, especially in terms of the research enterprise. So I spent a lot of time with our search firm, really working with them. There were lots of meetings that the search firm could have handled on their own probably, but instead as committee chair, I really wanted to do a lot of listening on the front end to the various stakeholders, faculty, staff, students, and alumni, so that I would know who would be a good candidate when we actually started moving on. So that's second, commit up front to listening to stakeholders. And third, I think, is to be decisive. There will come moments in the search in which the chair really has to make some critical decisions. So it may be something as simple as, do we hold 2 days of interviews or do we hold 1 day of interview? Do we designate 3 people as finalists or do we designate 4 people as finalists? Do we ask the candidates certain kinds of questions or not? And at some point, once everyone's had their say, sometimes the chair really does need to make a decision. And if the chair isn't willing to step up and be decisive, the entire process can really descend into chaos. And people don't feel like there is a strong direction. And when you have large committees that sometimes aren't used to dealing with each other. So you may have people who are alumni on the committee, junior faculty, staff people. So these people haven't typically been in a room together before. They need strong leadership and someone who, once all of the options are there on the table, who's willing to, in the difficult situations, make a decision. So that's the third one, I think, is have the commitment, listen up front to the stakeholders. Third, be decisive. And finally, I would say be transparent. I think that as chair, people need to trust you and to know that you have the best interests of the institution at heart. So when you're asked hard questions, sometimes you won't be able to disclose something because of confidentiality of a candidate or confidentiality related to other parts of the process, but you should say that up front. I can't disclose that to you because of some concerns about someone's privacy or confidentiality, or I don't think it's in the best interest of the institution to disclose it. But other than that, I think you really have to be transparent with your committee and really allow them to be in the process in a way that allows them to ultimately be the decision makers. So that's the fourth point, is to definitely try as much as you can to be transparent and upfront with the committee about where you're coming from, what your agenda is, and the things that you want to see the committee accomplish.
What means are readily available and appropriate for committee chair to use to maintain confidentiality? We're going to jump into another area which is so vital to successful search, particularly when persons both within and outside of the organization often demand transparency, and when state laws sometimes require that you keep people informed. What's the best way to maintain confidentiality, Dean Holley-Walker?
Yeah, so this was, of course, one of the areas that I felt kind of most comfortable in because of my role as an attorney. Obviously, as attorneys, confidentiality is something that we deal with all of the time. So in my role as chair of the committee, it was something that I felt fairly comfortable with. So I would say a couple of things that have to be done in order to maintain confidentiality, which is critical. Number one is to, the same as the president gives a charge about what the committee should do, the criteria they should be looking for, et cetera, I think you have to devote a meeting or maybe 2 meetings, but definitely a meeting to confidentiality in the process. I would recommend that you have someone from the Office of General Counsel at the university come in and talk to the committee about what it means to be on a search committee and what the demands are in terms of confidentiality. That presentation should also include information about state laws. So if you're a state university, you can have, almost all state universities have some kind of sunshine provision or a State Freedom of Information Act. Some of them can be fairly extreme. So for example, the Florida Sunshine Law, which allows for candidates to become public the minute that they submit any materials to the committee. So knowing what the lay of the land is, having a meeting in which the committee is educated, typically by the Office of General Counsel, sometimes it's fine for a search committee, or for the chair of the committee if they're knowledgeable about confidentiality issues. But I recommend, I think the best practice is to have someone from Office of General Counsel or even outside counsel for the university to come in and give the committee a presentation on what is confidentiality, what does it demand of the committee members, and any specific either bylaws of the university or state law that would apply in these circumstances. So that's the first thing, is really give the committee the lay of the land, explain what the rules are. Second, test your committee on the rules. So it's one thing for a committee member to hear a presentation, but I also think it's worthwhile to have a quiz at some point on confidentiality with hypotheticals so that people understand what the contours are. So for example, one thing that comes up often in the search process is if you're a faculty member, you're on the search committee, you have a colleague, maybe someone you're very close to, a friend, someone who's a neighbor or sits next door to you in your office. They swing by and want to have a casual conversation about how the search is going. And it's very difficult for most people to take a friend who's been a long-term colleague and tell them, actually, I can't talk to you about this because I'm restricted by confidentiality. And so you have to help your committee members with that. So I think a quiz is good. I think putting them in hypothetical situations can be good to help them to develop language that helps them to explain to people around them, especially people who they may be close to or they may feel are entitled to the information, to help them to maintain confidentiality. And finally, I think confidentiality agreements are key. So I think every committee member should sign a written agreement that explains to them that confidentiality means that they are not allowed to disclose anything about the search that is not part of the public record, that they are required to maintain that confidentiality before, during, and after candidates are interviewed, and that to not maintain that confidentiality is considered to be a breach of their employment obligations. So some pretty serious language, I think, that lets people know, because if not, you're not going to have candidates who will apply. And also there are some serious negative consequences that can happen if candidates, even after you select a dean or you select a new CFO or you select a candidate, once they're selected, if parts of their search are leaking out all over the place, that can be very detrimental for the candidate who's chosen. So I think it's of utmost importance. And I would say, finally, discourage all committee members from using methods of communication that are very disruptive to confidentiality. I would say the three most obvious ones are: one, very little information should be put on email about searches, and specifically debating about particular candidates should not be done by email. Two, discourage people from using text messages and other electronic forms of communication that can be easily forwarded to other people or exposed to other people. And finally, you shouldn't have to say this, but to remind committee members that social media is absolutely inappropriate for use when they are a member of a search committee. And this can be harder, because especially when the committee becomes subjected to a lot of criticism. You will get criticism that may be on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. The temptation to answer that criticism on social media is very tempting for a lot of committee members. And I think it's really important that committee members know that they can never, no matter what the attack is, answer those attacks on social media, because obviously that's counterproductive to the entire process, but also breaches confidentiality, specifically if it's about a particular candidate.
Good advice for us all, Dean Holley-Walker. Okay, my last question. You, as a sitting dean of a college, in a school or university, you serve as chair of search committees, and then you're charged with identifying and recruiting the dean of another college. How do you evaluate that practice? Do you think it's good for sitting deans to be chairs to hire other deans, or should it be cross divisions, or what's your advice?
I think it's actually a really good practice. It's one that we use here at Howard, and I think it's a really good practice. The reason why It was not one that was used at my previous institution a lot. Instead, sometimes it was used, sometimes they used other people as chairs. I think the great thing about using a dean as a chair is that there's no one closer to that process than a sitting dean. So for example, the questions that your candidates will have about how does budgeting work at the university? How does financial aid work at the university? How are you able to work with staff? What is your relationship like with university development and alumni relations? How do you interact with alumni? Those questions are going to be best answered by deans and are very difficult for other people to answer those questions, and they can't be answered generically. So that means if you're going to recruit good candidates, if you're going to ultimately have a successful search, I think deans are most knowledgeable and closest to the process in a way that allows candidates to get their questions answered, but also when it's time to actually recruit in a candidate, so you've identified the candidate, now you really need to bring them into the fold. I think a chair who's dean is going to be one of your most effective recruiters in that process. So I really think using deans as chairs is a wonderful practice and is something that is incredibly beneficial for the candidates. I think the biggest downside is that deans are so pressed for time. And the tendency of some deans to take these positions as chair and then allow a search committee to basically do all the work for them or most of the work for them is something that can be one of the most dangerous things to a successful search process. I think having a chair who does not completely commit to the process, and as a dean, it's easy to do that because the truth is, I mean, what is the reward for doing a great job, right? So deans have lots of things that bring them rewards. Raising money brings you lots of rewards. Dealing effectively with your faculty and faculty governance has lots of immediate positive consequences for you. Helping students and being there for students has a lot of things but honestly, being the successful leader of a search committee, you may get a few kudos here or there, but it's really something that's more of a service that you do for the university that does not have a lot of dramatic effect on how your job performance is ultimately viewed as dean. So I think that's the downside, is that the temptation, deans, when they're asked by a president, will ultimately say yes. There are very few deans who will say no to their president or provost who ask them to chair a search committee, but is the dean really committed to the search process and to doing what's necessary to making it a successful search? So my advice would be, if you're a dean, you're asked to lead a search process, don't even consider doing it unless you are willing to completely commit your time and energy to it being a success. It may not be one of the most immediately kind of highly visible things that you're lauded for, but ultimately you will be considered to be a good university citizen and someone who's really committed to the institution being the best it can be. And in the end, that is a tremendous reward in itself.
You've spoken on so many areas today: transparency, confidentiality, the role of the chair. But are there just the last few words of wisdom that you'd like to give the audience today, if they're considering being asked to be a chair, maybe for the first time, or if they've done it and didn't have a good outcome? And you've named some. I know you've talked about your commitment of time and you're being readily accessible and available to the committee, but is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we leave you today?
Yeah, I think experiences that help you learn a lot about who you are as a leader are experiences that are great to have. And so leading a search can reveal a lot to you about your own leadership style, your own weaknesses and strengths as a leader. I found it to be one of the most instructive things I did as a new dean. I saw what it was like to be a candidate on the dean's market, but also what kind of communicator is someone to be effective across constituencies, so across faculty, staff, and students. And I was able to tweak my own communication style, watching other people try to come into this role. So I think it's something that can be of a tremendous benefit to a dean who becomes chair of a search committee, to be able to examine and improve their own leadership style. I would say the last part is, if you don't have a successful search, search, it doesn't mean that, there was something that you did that was a failure. Just sometimes that happens. And sometimes the conditions are not right, or you just don't get the right candidates, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't try it again. Because there are some, I've been on some search committees where we either didn't find a candidate or we found one and it turned out later that the person was not the best fit. But I really use that as saying, okay, the next time I'm on a search committee, I learned from that experience to take it to a different place the next time. So I really hope that a lot of people out there who are listening, who have the opportunity to serve on search committees and particularly to serve as chairs of search committees, will really take the opportunity to do so and to use it as an opportunity to really do good on behalf of your institution and to learn a lot for yourself.
Well, thank you ever so much, Dean Holley-Walker. We appreciate you spending time with us. We have learned invaluable information. I feel like I want to run out there and lead a search right now.
Me too.
Well, thank you for being with us today.
Yes.
We wish you much continued success at the Howard University School of Law.
I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.